And tension heating up in the Middle East. Take a look at this. Well, Iran has fired a cruise missile today, further straining the country's relationship with the U.S., Europe, and Israel. The focus now in the critical Strait of Hormuz, a waterway where about a sixth of the world's oil is transported by sea. This, as hawkish rhetoric on both sides suggests, another war in the Middle East is brewing. So when it comes to foreign policy, what's in store for 2012? To discuss a range of foreign policy issues, Pepe Escobar joins us now from the studio in New York. Nice to see you, Pepe. Well, in the wake of today's events, Iran test firing a cruise missile. Is this another sign of rising tension and a step toward war with Iran?
Well, 2012 is going to be a really hardcore year. It's brinkmanship and blustering on both sides, U.S. and Tehran. Don't forget that on the 31st of December, Obama passed what is basically a criminalization operation of anyone who tries to do deals with the Iranian central bank. Well, Russia, we will ignore it. China will ignore it. South Korea, which is one of the top importers of Iranian energy, will ignore it. Other countries in the Middle East and Latin America or Central Asia, like Turkmenistan, they do gas swaps, for instance, will ignore it. The thing is, Iran is going to be paid for its energy in third-party accounts, in different accounts with the banks in Turkey, for instance, in yuan by the Chinese. In Venezuela, they have already an agreement. So these sanctions are not actually going to bite. So why have they been approved and why? And for what purpose, in fact? AIPAC, Israeli lobby, once again. So they are trying to ratchet up the rhetoric and ratchet up the economic sanctions against Iran, trying to push the U.S. in an electoral year to go to war in Iran, which is the variables are so infinite that you can't really know if there's any small measure of success in the end. So it's not going to work, basically. So this is how we start 2012.
And some call these sanctions an act of war. Would you go as far as to call it that?
Yes, it's an act of war. Can you imagine if it was the other way around, if these sanctions were against American exports of oil, or if these sanctions were against China, for instance, assuming China, main source of foreign exchange for China will be to export energy. It is an act of war. The thing is, how are you going to implement it? And who's going to respect it? Maybe the Europeans, like today, the French Foreign Ministry pathetically is saying, look, we have to curb our imports of Iranian oil. What's going to happen to the European economy if that happens? Oil, now it's 108 a barrel, so it's going to be 120. And in 1 month could be 140, 150. And you want to recover the economies of the US and Europe as well. With oil at 150, it's not going to happen. And it's a totally counterproductive law and amendments, and the way it's going to be interpreted by the Obama administration, I'm not sure they're going to try to provoke a confrontation against South Korea, for instance, an ally, with Russia, with China, or with countries in South America or in Central Asia, for that matter.
And Pepe, I also want to talk more about China, where you say the U.S. is engaging in a new Cold War. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, it is a new Cold War in terms of what happened with Hillary Clinton's trip to Central Asia about a month and a half ago, Obama's trip to Australia and Southeast Asia a month and a half ago, more or less, and this deployment of Marines to Darwin in Northern Australia, and the progressive, in the minds of Washington, of course, encirclement of China in the South China Sea and the intersection between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This is completely crazy because instead of America proposing a project for Southeast Asia, or for the countries in the South China Sea, or a vision for the future, it's another militarization drive. And the Chinese, of course, because the Chinese diasporas, they are extremely powerful in all these Southeast Asian countries. So when there's something to be negotiated in the South China Sea, it will be on the table between China and the Philippines, China and Vietnam, China and Indonesia, and not with American military interference. So it sounds and it looks like a desperate ploy from a declining empire once again. So we keep repeating the same scenario over and over again, you know.
Now, Pepe, I want to shift a little bit to a controversial law recently signed into law by President Obama, and it's related because, you know, the U.S. launches these wars, takes these steps, all in the name of fighting terrorism. He recently signed this new piece of legislation into law. It's the National Defense Authorization Act, and this act allows for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens. And his justification when he signed this was, quote, "Ultimately, I decided to sign this bill not only because of the critically important services it provides for our forces and their families and the national security programs it authorizes, but also because the Congress revised provisions that would otherwise have jeopardized the safety, security, and liberty of the American people." So he is justifying it, but he has said, just a moment, that he is very weary about some of the controversial things in the bill. So Pepe, if there is such controversial aspects of the bill, why would he sign it? And what are the greater implications of this?
Absolutely, it's crazy. He was forced this law by the AIPAC lobby in Congress. You have a bunch of people in Congress which are despised by the overwhelming majority of the American population. Like Congress approval rate nowadays is what, 10–12% maximum. They forced this law to Obama. He signed reluctantly with the caveat, look, maybe if something happens, it's up to my discretion to apply this or not. But the problem is, the law is already signed. So assuming Obama would not do anything in terms of imprisoning Americans forever, you have the right to remain detained for the rest of your life. That's what it means, this law. But the next president, especially if it's a Republican hardcore president, might well do it. And presidents after that as well. So this is crazy because now it's the letter of the law. So in terms of the whole myth that is being propagated over and over again for, you know, since the Declaration of Independence, that this is a full-blown democracy, now it's over. And it's for everyone to see. Even countries that are extremely authoritarian can point to the U.S. and say, look, your own citizens are not even free anymore. You can throw the whole population in jail if you want to, with the excuse of terrorism. So this means another thing, the war on terror. It was not that when Osama bin Laden was killed or not killed a few months ago. The war on terror lives on.
And Pepe, I just want to ask you one more question. Looking ahead, what is in store for 2012? And do you see more violent conflicts in the Middle East as inevitable at this point?
Look, I've been talking to some people this past few weeks, historians, university professors, political science majors, and there's a sort of unofficial consensus that maybe we are approaching a 1914 situation in 2012. Where, do you remember Sarajevo in 1914? That was, you know, the beginning of the First World War, the Great War for Civilization, as it was built. This is not going to be a great war for civilization. On the contrary, it would be barbarism hardcore. If you remember that General Mike Mullen, the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his idea to deal with Iran was a monster shock and awe. Was an attack that, you know, Iraq in 2003 compared to it would be like Disneyland, to completely shatter the communications and the lines of communication of the regime in Tehran, humiliated in front of the Iranians, and then Iranians would rally, depose the regime, and the US will have a new satrapy in the Middle East. Obviously, this cannot possibly work, but still a lot of people in the Pentagon, neocons and all that, they still think it might.
Pepe, a lot to talk about. We'll definitely have to continue this conversation another time. So not much to look forward to, it seems, for the new year, but a happy new year to you. That was Asia Times correspondent
Happy New Year to you and everybody.
Pepe Escobar.
Thank you.